The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error if error seduce them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. Carl Jung, a psychologist, believed that our incapacity to cope with the forces of our own psyche posed a greater threat to society than either natural forces or physical illnesses. As the Latin saying goes, man is a wolf to man, meaning that we are our own greatest enemies. This proverb, according to Jung in Civilization in Transition, is a sad but timeless truth, and our wolf-like tendencies are most evident during historical periods when mental illness becomes the norm rather than the exception in a society, a situation he called a psychic epidemic. He writes that it is becoming increasingly clear that the biggest threat to humanity is not famine, earthquakes, bacteria, or cancer, but rather man himself. For the straightforward reason that there is insufficient defense against mental illnesses which are far more destructive than even the most severe natural disasters. We will examine mass psychosis, the most hazardous of all psychic epidemics, in this video. A mass psychosis is an epidemic of insanity that happens when a significant section of a community becomes delusional and loses touch with reality. The phenomenon in question is not a work of fiction. The 16th and 17th century witch hunts in America and Europe, as well as the 20th century development of totalitarianism, are two instances of mass insanity. Before we go any further, please like the video. It really helps to bring this content to more people. What do you think of the idea that the greatest danger to humanity comes from the human mind itself? Leave your opinion in the comments. Let's debate about it. Thousands of people, primarily women, were murdered during the witch hunts, not because they had committed any crimes, but rather because they were used as scapegoats by insane communities. Francis Hill claims that after the craze had finally burned itself out, there were hardly any women left alive in some Swiss communities. The consequences of a widespread psychosis are disastrous. After researching this phenomenon, Jung claimed that the members of the infected society involuntarily descend to a lower intellectual level and become morally and spiritually inferior. They grow more irrational, careless, emotional, unpredictable, and untrustworthy. And worst of all, the group enamored with crazy openly commits acts that the individual alone could never tolerate. The fact that people experiencing a mass psychosis are ignorant of what is happening exacerbates the situation. There is no Archimedean point from which people experiencing mass psychosis may see their collective insanity, just as a person who has gone insane cannot leave his head to see the mistakes in his ways. What, however, triggers a mass psychosis? We must first investigate what makes a person insane in order to respond to this issue. Although excessive drug or alcohol use, brain damage, and other disorders are among the numerous possible causes of madness, we won't be concerned with these medical issues in this article. Since psychological triggers, also known as psychogenic triggers, are the most frequent causes of mass psychosis, we are concerned about them. A surge of negative emotions like fear or worry that sends a person into a panic is the most common psychogenic cause of psychosis. Since it is extremely taxing on the mind and body to continue in this hyper-emotional state, people in panic will instinctively want for relief, while adaptive strategies like confronting and eliminating the fear-inducing threat might help people escape from the state of panic. Having a psychotic break is another option to do so. Contrary to popular belief, a psychotic break is not a plunge into a state of greater disorder, but rather a reorganization of one's experiential universe that combines reality and delusions, or fact and fiction, in a way that helps put an end to panic attacks. One of the leading experts on schizophrenia of the 20th century, Silvano Arietti, describes the psychogenic processes that result in insanity. First, there is the panic phase, during which the patient begins to see things differently, becomes afraid of them, looks perplexed, and is unable to articulate the bizarre events that are taking place. The next stage is what Arietti refers to as a phase of psychotic insight, in which a person is able to make sense of his abnormal experiences by coming up with a pathological perspective on reality. Because the patient at last recognizes connections and meaning in his experiences, the process is known as insight. However, the insight is psychotic, as it is predicated on delusions rather than on healthy and constructive responses to the threats that cause the panic. According to Arietti, a psychotic break can be seen as an atypical way of coping with an intense state of worry because the delusions, in other words, allow the person experiencing panic to escape from the flood of unpleasant feelings, but at the expense of losing touch with reality. If a weak and susceptible person experiences a rush of negative emotions that might cause a psychotic episode, then a population of weak and vulnerable people may experience mass psychosis if they are frightened by actual, imagined, or made-up threats. The precise way a mass psychosis develops will vary depending on the historical and cultural background of the affected society. But in the modern era, the mass psychosis of totalitarianism seems to pose the biggest threat because delusions can take many different forms, and madness can show up in countless ways. According to Arthur Versluy, totalitarianism is the contemporary occurrence of completely concentrated state power combined with the disregard for individual human rights. The victims and the objectified masses coexist in the totalized state alongside the ruling class. The populace in a totalitarian society is split into two groups, the ruled and the rulers, and both groups experience pathological change. The rulers are given an almost divine position, which is completely at odds with the fact that we are fallible creatures who are readily tainted by power. On the other side, the people become the dependent subjects of these sick dictators and become childlike and psychologically regressed. One of the leading experts on this type of governance in the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, described totalitarianism as an effort to alter human nature. The social transformation that occurs under totalitarianism is based on and maintained by delusions, because only deluded men and women regress to the childlike status of obedient and submissive subjects and hand over complete control of their lives to politicians and bureaucrats. However, this attempted transformation only turns sound minds into sick minds, because as the Dutch medical doctor who studied the mental effects of living under totalitarianism wrote, there is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitarianism and their culture as a whole on the one hand, and the reactions of the sick schizophrenic on the other. Only a deluded ruling class will think they have the knowledge, wisdom, and savvy to take over society from the top down. Only when delusions are strong will anyone think that a society with power-hungry rulers on the one hand and a psychologically backward populace on the other will result in anything other than widespread misery and social destruction. However, what sets off totalitarianism's psychosis? The governing elite of a society is where the mass psychosis of totalitarianism starts, as was discussed in the earlier film in this series. Whether they are politicians, bureaucrats, or crony capitalists, the people in this class are prone to delusions that increase their authority, and nothing appeals to those who crave power more than the idea that they can and should rule and dominate a community. When a ruling class adopts a political ideology such as communism, fascism, or technocracy, the next step is to infect the populace with the mass psychosis of totalitarianism in order to persuade them to accept their rule. Many times throughout history, this psychosis has been brought on by appropriately manipulating group emotions, as Merleau describes. The term menticide, which comes from the English killing of the mind, refers to the general means by which members of a ruling elite can achieve this goal. As Merleau goes on to explain, menticide is an ancient crime against the human mind and spirit that has been reorganized. Through a systematic system of judicial perversion and psychological intervention, the ruling class may ingrain their own opportunistic ideas into the minds of people they intend to exploit and destroy. The first step in preparing a populace for menticide is to instill terror. A person is particularly vulnerable to a decline into illusions of lunacy when they are overcome with unpleasant emotions, such as dread or anxiety. Real, imagined, or made-up threats can be used to instill dread, but waves of terror are a particularly powerful tactic. This method alternates periods of calm with the sowing of fear, but each of these intervals is followed by the creation of a fear spell that is even more intense than the one that came before it. As Mirlou writes, this process can be repeated repeatedly because people are still troubled by their past experiences. With every new propaganda campaign, morality declines and the psychological impacts intensify. It reaches an already receptive public. While a populace is primed for menticide by terror, the people's minds are broken down by the use of propaganda to disseminate false information and create misunderstanding about the nature of the problem and the threats. Contradictory news, illogical information, and outright lies can be used by government officials and their aides in the media because the more people are confused, the less equipped they will be to handle the situation and reduce their fear in a sensible and adaptive way. As Mirlou says, never in history have such effective means existed to manipulate a society into the psychosis of totalitarianism. In other words, confusion increases the vulnerability of dissidents into the delusions of dictatorship. Those in positions of authority can readily attack the public's perceptions thanks to smartphones, social media, television, and the internet, as well as algorithms that swiftly filter the flow of undesirable information. Furthermore, because these technologies are addictive, a remarkably high number of individuals willingly expose themselves to the propaganda of the ruling class. Stimuli are constantly flooding the senses. Man no longer learns to scrutinize his surroundings. The screen provides him with pre-made replies. Isolating the victims and interfering with their regular social relationships is another measure that would-be totalitarian rulers can take to raise the likelihood of a totalitarian psychosis. A person is much more prone to delusions when they are alone themselves and don't have regular interactions with friends, family, and co-workers for a number of reasons. First of all, they are cut off from the corrective power of the positive example, since not everyone is duped by the ruling class's schemes, and those who are able to see through the propaganda can assist in rescuing others from the mental attack. However, the impact of these positive experiences is significantly reduced if seclusion is enforced. However, humans, like many other species, are more readily conditioned into new thought and behavior patterns when they are separated, which is another reason why isolation makes menicides more effective. Or, as Mirlou says, Ivan Pavlov, a physiologist who studied behavioral conditioning, made yet another important finding. The best environment for developing the conditioned reflex would be a calm lab with few distracting inputs. Every animal trainer is aware of this based on personal experience. To tame wild animals, isolation and patient repetition of stimuli are necessary. This norm has been adhered to by totalitarians. They are aware that isolating their political victims is the fastest way to condition them. A population under menticide onslaught becomes defenseless and despairing as they are left alone, bewildered, and beaten by waves of horror. Once rational minds are transformed into playhouses of irrational forces by the constant barrage of misinformation. The masses yearn for a return to a more orderly society because turmoil is roiling both inside and outside of them. Now is the time for the potential totalitarians to make the final move. In a world that appears to be swiftly going in the other direction, they can provide a means of escape and a return to order. However, there is a cost to all of this. The ruling class must gain control over all facets of life, and the masses must relinquish their freedom. They must become docile and subservient subjects and give up their ability to be independent, self-governing individuals. Stated differently, the people must succumb to the delusions of totalitarian madness. The 20th century's totalitarian regimes are an example of a form of mass insanity. Reason and basic human decency are rendered impossible in such a system, whether gradually or abruptly. All that exists is a generalized sense of fear and a projection of the enemy that is thought to be among us. Thus, under pressure from the ruling class, society turns against itself. However, a totalitarian world's order is pathological. Totalitarianism takes away the spontaneity that creates many of life's pleasures and the innovation that propels society ahead by imposing rigid conformity and demanding blind obedience from the populace. No matter what name it goes by, complete control of this type of rule, whether it comes from a dictator, scientists, or doctors, or from politicians and bureaucrats, breeds widespread death, destruction, and stagnation. Therefore, the question of how to stop totalitarianism may be the most crucial one the world is currently confronting. And is it possible to undo the effects of inducing a society into the initial phases of this mass psychosis? There are actions that can be performed to help effect a cure, even if it is impossible to predict the outcome of a collective lunacy. However, this endeavor requires a wide range of approaches from a wide range of individuals, because the counterattack must be multifaceted, just like the menticidal attack. According to Carl Jung, the first step for those of us who want to contribute to the restoration of sanity in an insane world is to organize our own thoughts and lead lives that serve as an example for others. Our generation's cry for the Redeemer personality, the person who can free himself from the clutches of the collective psychosis and save at least his own soul, is not in vain. He shines a light of hope for others by announcing that at least one man has managed to free himself from the deadly identity with the group psyche. However, there are other actions that can be taken if one is living in a way that is not influenced by the psychosis. Since the truth is more potent than the fiction and lies promoted by the would-be totalitarian rulers, information that contradicts the propaganda should be disseminated as widely as possible. As a result, their success depends in part on their capacity to restrict the free flow of information. Another strategy is to delegitimize the ruling class through humor and mockery. As Mirlou notes, we must learn to utilize mockery as a weapon against demagogues and would-be dictators among us. The demagogue himself is nearly incapable of any kind of humor, and he will start to crumble if we make fun of him. Building what are known as parallel structures is a strategy advocated by Václav Havel, a political rebel during Soviet communist government who went on to become president of Czechoslovakia. Any kind of institution, business, organization, technology, or creative endeavor that is both ethically and geographically located outside of a totalitarian society is considered to have a parallel structure. Havel observed that these parallel systems worked better against authoritarianism in communist Czechoslovakia than did political activity. Additionally, as Havel describes in his book The Power of the Powerless, a second culture, or parallel civilization, emerges on its own and serves as a haven of liberty and reason. In a totalitarian world, provided sufficient parallel structures are established, what else could parallel structures be except a space where another life can be lived, one that is in accordance with its own goals and that organizes itself according to those goals? Are those early attempts at social self-organization anything other than the attempts of a particular segment of society to break free from the self-sustaining elements of totalitarianism and, consequently, to drastically withdraw from its participation in the totalitarian system? Above all, however, action by as many people as possible is necessary to prevent a complete plunge into the madness of totalitarianism. This is because just as the ruling class does not sit around doing nothing but actively working to expand their power, so too must a concerted and active effort be made to return the world to a state of freedom. In a world that is succumbing to the illusions of dictatorship, this can be a huge task, but as Thomas Paine pointed out, tyranny is difficult to defeat, much like hell. Nevertheless, we have the comforting knowledge that the more difficult the struggle, the more magnificent the victory. So, what did you learn today about the threats of mass psychosis? If this video helped you understand the subject better, please like it and share it with someone who also needs to see it. Let's spread this knowledge and fight illusions together.